Today, we're embarking on a journey into the profound and, frankly, a bit unsettling mind of one of the 20th century's most prescient thinkers, Jean Baudrillard.
Absolutely. A really challenging figure.
We're cracking open his seminal work, Simulacra and Simulation. Now, this book, originally published in French in 1981, with Sheila Faria Glazer's English translation following in 1994, feels incredibly, almost eerily relevant in our current world.
It really does, doesn't it?
Think about the pervasive digital realities we navigate, the rapid rise of AI-generated content, and the sheer information overload that defines our daily lives.
Yeah, it's like he saw it coming.
Baudrillard's insights, written decades ago, seem to have anticipated much of this. It's a dense philosophical text, no doubt, but our mission today is to dig out the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Make it accessible.
Exactly. Make these complex ideas accessible, even entertaining, and find those aha moments that can genuinely shift how you perceive the world around you.
That's absolutely right. Today we're diving into a world where the lines between the real and the artificial are not just blurred, but have perhaps vanished entirely.
Vanished. That's a strong claim.
Well, that's Baudrillard for you. We'll explore his radical claim that models and signs might now precede and even generate what we perceive as reality, rather than merely reflecting it.
Okay. Precede and generate.
This invites us to consider a truly fascinating and somewhat disturbing question. What happens when the map becomes so dominant, so all-encompassing, that it's more real than the territory it's supposed to represent?
That's a powerful thought, isn't it? Okay, let's unpack this mind-bending concept of the hyperreal and explore how it plays out in everything, from our entertainment to our political systems and even our own deepest sense of self.
Yeah, it touches everything.
You might just start seeing the world through a Baudrillardian lens after this. So, Baudrillard begins Simulacra and Simulation with an incredibly provocative quote, one he highlights from Ecclesiastes. "The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true."
Bam. Right out of the gate.
Right off the bat, he's telling us that this isn't simply about deception or a false representation of something real. It's about a fundamentally different kind of reality altogether.
Exactly. One where the copy or the model isn't just like an original.
That is the origin.
That's the idea. Making the very idea of an original truth obsolete. It's a very unsettling way to start because it immediately challenges our conventional understanding of truth and falsehood.
It really throws you off balance.
What's particularly insightful here is how Baudrillard reinterprets Jorge Luis Borges' famous fable. You know the one.
The map covering the territory.
That's it. Where an empire's cartographers draw a map so detailed, so utterly precise, that it eventually covers the entire territory. For Borges, this was the ultimate allegory of simulation, the map becoming indistinguishable from reality.
A classic image.
But Baudrillard argues that this fable, which once seemed to perfectly capture the essence of representation, has now come full circle for us and only possesses the discrete charm of second-order simulacra.
Second order, meaning it's outdated.
It's almost quaint, he suggests, because it implies there's still a territory to map, a real thing being represented. Our current condition, he insists, has moved way beyond that.
So if that classic fable is now second order, what has fundamentally changed? What's the new, deeper definition of simulation that Baudrillard is proposing?
Baudrillard clarifies this crucial shift by stating that today, abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept.
Okay, so not representation.
In other words, our relationship to reality is no longer about reflection or representation. Instead, he asserts, simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance.
No territory, no substance.
Previously, a map or a double was always a secondary instance, right?
Yeah.
Pointing back to something real that existed before it.
Yeah, the original.
But now, Baudrillard claims, simulation is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality. This is a monumental shift from how we've traditionally understood the relationship between models and reality.
And this is precisely where we encounter the term hyperreal.
Hyperreal, yes.
A real that is, in a sense, more real than real. He introduces this concept through the procession of simulacra, arguing that the map precedes the territory, that engenders the territory.
The map comes first.
He even dramatically suggests that if we were to revisit Borges' fable today, it is the territory whose shreds slowly rot across the extent of the map. So if the model creates the reality, if the signs themselves generate the world we inhabit, then what happens to our genuine lived experience? Where does authenticity even fit into this equation?
It implies that we are living in the desert of the real itself.
Whoa. the desert of the real.
Baudrillard is asserting that the foundational real, the original, has receded, perhaps even vanished, and we are left primarily with simulations that precede and generate what we perceive as real.
Like that Instagram example you mentioned.
Exactly. Consider how we experience so much of our world today. A perfectly curated Instagram feed, for instance, filled with aspirational images, often feels more real, more authentic and desirable than the messy, imperfect, lived experience it purportedly represents.
The model comes first.
The model, the digital sign, the idealized image comes first. The lived reality then often tries to conform to it or simply becomes secondary, a mere echo of the hyperreal model.
This is where it gets truly fascinating and profoundly unsettling. Baudrillard suggests that with this radical shift in how reality is constructed, it is all of metaphysics that is lost.
All of it.
He's talking about the foundational philosophical distinctions that Western thought has relied on for centuries, the clear line between being and appearances, between the real thing and its concept.
The whole basis of philosophy, really.
Historically, philosophy sought to uncover the true essence behind appearances. But if that fundamental distinction is gone, if there's no clear mirror of being and appearances reflecting a deeper truth, then what are we left with? What exactly are we measuring our reality against?
What's left, Baudrillard argues, is a new dimension of simulation he calls genetic miniaturization.
Genetic miniaturization, like DNA.
Sort of. Imagine our reality isn't growing organically from a singular, unique source, but is instead being assembled, endlessly reproduced from tiny, pre-programmed data points or cells in a memory bank.
Okay.
The real is now produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control. These models, these codes, can be reproduced an indefinite number of times. This hyperreal, he explains, no longer needs to be rational, because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational.
Operational, meaning it just works.
It exists simply by functioning, by being effective. It's produced from a radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere. It's an artificially constructed environment where the system's smooth operation becomes its own sole justification.
So it's almost like an artificial resurrection then, where the model short-circuits all its vicissitudes.
Yeah, all the messy bits.
Meaning all its natural changes, risks, and unpredictabilities, preventing the real from producing itself organically. It's a system sheltered from the imaginary and from any distinction between the real and the imaginary.
A closed loop.
The model creates a perfectly controlled environment, a kind of closed loop, where symbolic unpredictability and even death, in a metaphorical sense, are preempted. It sounds like a world designed to eliminate any true surprises.
Precisely. This concept is incredibly important. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real.
Substituting signs for the real.
This means the system isn't trying to trick us into believing a fake is real. Instead, it creates a reality from signs alone, making the original truth or actual real thing completely unnecessary.
You don't need the original anymore.
It's not just a copy. It's a new, self-sufficient reality built directly from the blueprint, the code. The signs are sufficient unto themselves, operating without needing a deeper reference point.
Now let's pivot and look at a specific, powerful example that brings this abstract idea of simulacra into sharp focus. Baudrillard's interpretation of religion and the simulacrum of divinity.
Ah, the iconoclasts.
He highlights the historical iconoclast quarrel, quoting a fascinating ancient idea. I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented.
Because God is beyond representation.
So the prohibition was against representing God because true divinity, like nature, is beyond human grasp. But what happens then when divinity is represented, when images of the sacred proliferate?
The iconoclast quarrel was profound because their fear wasn't just that images of God would distort the truth or that they were merely idols. Their deeper, more terrifying fear was that these simulacra, these representations, would actually efface God.
Efface. Wipe out.
Yes, by revealing that deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum.
Whoa! That God was always just an image.
They believed the images held a destructive, annihilating truth, that by making God visible would paradoxically expose the nothingness or emptiness behind the sacred veil.
So destroying the images was metaphysical panic?
Their violent urge to destroy these images, therefore, was born from a desperate metaphysical despair, a fear that the very act of representation would extinguish the divine.
That's a truly chilling point. Baudrillard contrasts this with the iconolators, those who embraced images, viewing them as the most modern minds. Why would he see them that way?
Because in allowing God to become apparent, to be seen in the mirror of images, they were, in Baudrillard's view, already enacting his death and his disappearance in the epiphany of his representations.
So making God visible killed him.
In a sense. They might have known, perhaps instinctively, that these representations no longer represented anything, that they were purely a game, but that this great game was the new reality.
A game.
Baudrillard notes that it's profoundly dangerous to unmask images, because their true function might not be to hide something real, but to dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them.
Hiding the nothingness.
He then draws a direct line from this religious history to the Jesuits, whose politics, he argues, were based on the virtual disappearance of God and the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciences.
Okay, the Jesuits.
For Baudrillard, the evanescence of God and the epiphany of power meant the end of transcendence, which then became an alibi for a strategy of power altogether free of influences and signs.
So power without divine justification.
What's so incredibly insightful here is how Baudrillard connects this ancient historical religious debate to what he calls the murderous power of images.
Murderous power.
Images for him were far from benign reflections. They could be murderers of the real, murderers of their own model, by consuming and replacing what they supposedly represent.
So Baudrillard suggests this historical moment signals a decisive turning point. A radical shift from signs that dissimulate something which he links to traditional theology or even political ideology where signs might hide a truth.
Right? Hiding a truth.
Signs that dissimulate that there is nothing.
Hiding the void. That's the crucial difference.
In this new era of simulation, there is no longer a God to recognize his own, no longer a last judgment to separate the false from the true, the real from its artificial resurrection, as everything is already dead and resurrected in advance.
Already dead and resurrected. Like a zombie reality.
It paints a picture of a world where the very concept of authenticity has lost its foundation, where everything is a rerun.
And this leads Baudrillard to conclude that when the real is no longer what it was, nostalgia assumes its full meaning.
Ah, nostalgia. We see that everywhere.
We observe a plethora of myths of origin and signs of reality, a plethora of truth, of secondary objectivity and authenticity. Think about how much of our culture is obsessed with authenticity.
Oh yeah, craft beer, vintage clothes.
From farm-to-table food to unfiltered social media posts, all of which might actually be manufactured signs. This panic-stricken production of the real and of the referential is a strategy of the real, of the near-real and the hyper-real that everywhere is the double of a strategy of deterrence.
Deterrence, like nuclear deterrence.
Similar logic. It's not about genuinely creating the real, but about endlessly generating signs of the real, an overflowing quantity of truth, precisely to deter us from noticing the terrifying absence, the void, at the core.
It's a smokescreen.
A very effective one. It keeps us busy chasing authenticity while the real slips away.
So Baudrillard's suggesting that this panic-stricken production of the real and of the referential is essentially a strategy of the real, of the near-real, and the hyper-real that everywhere is the double of a strategy of deterrence.
That's the core of it, yeah.
It's like we're constantly being overwhelmed and distracted by an endless torrent of real information, authentic experiences, and urgent crises.
Keep them busy.
Specifically to prevent us from pausing, looking deeper, and noticing the fundamental emptiness or absence of an original reality underneath. It's a very clever, very disturbing, and very subtle form of control.
Subtle is the key word. It operates below the level of conscious awareness, mostly.
Yeah.
2. Simulation in action, unpacking real-world examples.
Let's transition from Baudrillard's abstract philosophical concepts to some of his truly striking real-world examples, starting with the section he calls Ramses, or the rosy-colored resurrection.
The mummy.
He introduces the Tassidae people, a supposed Stone Age tribe discovered deep in the Philippine jungle in 1971, living in complete isolation for centuries. This is a fascinating and unsettling case study for Baudrillard.
Indeed, Baudrillard provocatively claims that this discovery marked the paradoxical death of ethnology.
The death of the science that studies them. How?
Upon contact, these indigenous people began to disintegrate, much like mummies in the open air when exposed to oxygen. So what happened? The Philippine government, supposedly on the suggestion of anthropologists, decided to return the Tassidae to their primitive state, sealing them off from the outside world indefinitely.
Preserve them.
But Baudrillard argues that in order for ethnology to live, its object must die. By dying, by being preserved in isolation, the object takes its revenge for being discovered and, paradoxically, defies the very science that sought to grasp it. Their preservation became their symbolic extermination.
So the very act of studying and saving this culture, Baudrillard suggests, is actually a sacrifice or a simulation of sacrifice to preserve the discipline's own reality principle.
Exactly. Science needs its primitive object to remain primitive.
It's not about genuine, authentic preservation, because science, for Baudrillard, is always murderous. By enclosing them in what he calls the glass coffin of the virgin forest, they become an eternal guarantee for the idea of the primitive rather than living, evolving people.
Precisely. The Tassidae become referential simulacra. They are frozen, cryogenized, sterilized, protected to death. Science itself in this act becomes pure simulation.
Wow.
The Indian, thus returned to the ghetto, confined to the glass coffin of the virgin forest, again becomes the model of simulation of all the possible Indians from before ethnology.
The perfect specimen.
This is, ironically, a triumph for ethnology, because it reinvents them as the perfectly pristine, untouched savages needed to validate the science, even as it destroys their lived reality. It's a fantastic, almost cynical move by the system.
He connects this chilling idea to other forms of museumification, like the working-class neighborhoods museumified in situ at Crusoe, turning living communities into historical witnesses, fossilized alive.
Yeah, making living history into a dead exhibit.
It's as if the museum, instead of being circumscribed as a geometric site, is everywhere now, like a dimension of life. Our authentic experiences are processed and framed for consumption, losing their raw, lived quality, becoming relics even while they are still happening.
This leads us to a truly thought-provoking assertion. Baudrillard famously states, "We are all Tassidaes, Indians who have again become what they were, simulacral Indians who at last proclaim the universal truth of ethnology."
We are all Tassidaes. How so?
He suggests this murder of symbolic forms, first inflicted upon savages in the name of preservation, now extends to Western societies as well. We too are living specimens, artificially resurrected under the auspices of the real in a world of simulation,
Living in our own glass coffins.
where the blackmail of the real leads to the murder of every symbolic form and of its hysterical historical retrospection. Our own reality is becoming a carefully curated exhibit.
And he brings in another powerful, almost absurd example, the Ramses II mummy.
Ramsey.
Yeah. After rotting for several decades in the depths of a museum, immense scientific and technological resources were mobilized to preserve it, even taking it to France for complex treatments.
Gotta save the mummy.
The West, Baudrillard argues, is seized with panic at the prospect of not being able to stockpile the past in plain view. We seemingly need a visible past, a visible continuum, a visible myth of origin, a perfectly preserved antiquity to reassure us about our own future and sense of identity.
He contrasts traditional embalming, which was a mythical effort that strove to immortalize a hidden dimension, a spiritual connection to the afterlife,
Right, symbolic.
with modern science's attempt to restore a purely visible order. The mummy, Baudrillard says, dies from being transplanted from a slow order of the symbolic to an order of history, science, and museums, our order.
Our order, which only knows science.
Which no longer masters anything, which only knows how to condemn what preceded it to decay and death, and subsequently to try to revive it with science. It's an irreparable violence toward all secrets, he argues. The violence of a civilization without secrets. Hatred of a whole civilization for its own foundation.
A civilization without secrets.
Even the restoration of the ancient Saint-Michel de Cuxa cloister, transported from New York back to its original site, is seen not as a return to authenticity, but as the creation of an even more artificial, total simulacrum. We're so desperate for the real that we rebuild it as a perfect fake.
Let's turn to a place many of us know well, or at least know of, Disneyland. Baudrillard famously calls it a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra.
Disneyland, the happiest place on earth. Or is it?
What's his take on this seemingly innocent, magical theme park?
He begins by describing Disneyland as a play of illusions and phantasms. The Pirates of the Caribbean, Frontierland, Tomorrowland. Standard stuff.
Yeah, the rides, the fantasy.
But what truly attracts the crowds, he argues, is something far deeper. It's the social microcosm, the religious miniaturized pleasure of real America, of its constraints and joys.
Miniaturized America.
It's a hyper-distilled, sanitized version of the American way of life, embalmed and pacified, a kind of perfect, idealized vision. Think of how perfectly clean, efficient, and friendly everything is. It's almost too perfect.
And this leads to his core provocative argument. Baudrillard states, Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America, that is Disneyland.
Whoa, America is Disneyland.
A bit like prisons are there to hide that it is the social in its entirety that is carceral.
Okay, that prison analogy helps.
This isn't about a false representation of reality, like an ideology that masks a hidden truth. Instead, Disneyland's true function is concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle.
Saving the reality principle.
The imaginary of Disneyland, he suggests, is a deterrence machine designed to rejuvenate the fiction of the real in the opposite camp. It creates a false boundary between the real world outside and the imaginary world within.
Right. The gates.
Making the outside seem truly real by contrast, even if it's already profoundly simulated.
So Disneyland makes the rest of LA seem real. That's wild.
He extends this idea to other imaginary stations around Los Angeles, like the Enchanted Village or Magic Mountain. These places feed reality, the energy of the real, to a city whose mystery is precisely that of no longer being anything but a network of incessant, unreal circulation, a city of incredible proportions, but without space, without dimension.
LA is pure circulation.
Yeah, that fits. Disneyland for him functions as a space of the regeneration of the imaginary as waste treatment plants are elsewhere.
Regenerating imagination like sewage.
The dreams, phantasms, the historical, fairy-like, legendary, imaginary, all those traditional forms of imagination become a waste product, the first great toxic excrement of a hyperreal civilization that has no more use for them outside of this controlled environment.
So it's a containment zone for fantasy.
So it's a kind of recycling center for our collective discarded imaginary, a place where fantasies go to be processed and made safe. He also connects this to a range of sexual, psychic, somatic recycling institutes that proliferate in California.
Like yoga, jogging.
Citing examples like contactotherapy, jogging, natural food, and yoga. These aren't just fads. He sees them as actively reinventing a penury sign, a penury simulacrum, where lost faculties or lost bodies are re-socialized and repackaged as new forms of authenticity or wellness.
Selling naturalness back to us.
It's a sophisticated market economy that reinvents scarcity and naturalness as signs themselves, sold back to us as commodities.
Clever and a bit depressing.
Now let's move to the political realm, with the infamous Watergate scandal, which Baudrillard presents as another profound Disneyland scenario.
Watergate is Disneyland. Okay, explain.
He claims the entire scandal effect actually hid that there is no difference between the facts and their denunciation. He goes so far as to suggest that the methods employed by the CIA and those by the Washington Post journalists in their respective pursuits were, in his view, identical in their operational logic.
So the spies and the reporters were playing the same game.
That's his argument. He argues that the denunciation of scandal is always an homage to the law. Watergate, in this sense, succeeded in imposing the idea that Watergate was a scandal. In this sense, it was a prodigious operation of intoxication.
Intoxication.
Its ultimate effect, he suggests, was to re-inject a large dose of political morality re-injected on a world scale.
So the scandal helped the system.
He draws a parallel to sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, suggesting that capital, the overarching system, functions behind a moral superstructure, and those who revive public morality, even through indignation and outcry, work spontaneously for the order of capital.
Even the critics help capital.
Therefore, Baudrillard chillingly concludes, Watergate is not a scandal. This is what must be said at all costs because it is what everyone is busy concealing. The system used the scandal to reaffirm its own perceived legitimacy.
Wow, so the outrage was actually useful.
What's truly insightful here is the idea that capital, this vast, monstrous system, doesn't actually care about our rational or moral critiques. It's a monstrous, unprincipled enterprise.
Beyond good and evil, sort of.
And it's us, particularly the left, Baudrillard argues, that holds out the mirror of equivalence to capital, hoping that it will comply with some imagined social contract or ethical framework.
Trying to make the monster play by the rules.
We're constantly trying to impose rules on something that is, at its core, fundamentally beyond such rules, and in doing so, we might actually be reinforcing its power.
He then introduces the concept of Mobius spiraling negativity.
The Mobius strip, one side.
Imagine a Mobius strip, a surface with only one side. Baudrillard suggests that Watergate, far from being a true political crisis, was a lure held out by the system to catch its adversaries, a simulation of scandal for regenerative ends.
A fake scandal to trap opponents.
He even entertains the idea that Beep Throat, the famous anonymous source, might have been a Republican insider manipulating left-wing journalists to get rid of Nixon.
Plausible.
But notes that this detail is almost superfluous because, in Baudrillard's view, the left spontaneously does the work of the right anyway by engaging in the game of morality.
Because they believe in the rule.
In a field unhinged by simulation, linear continuity and dialectical polarity cease to exist. All determination evaporates, every act is terminated at the end of the cycle, having benefited everyone and having been scattered in all directions. There's no clear cause and effect anymore, just a self-referential loop.
This Mobius spiral means that contradictory interpretations can all be simultaneously true. It's a dizzying thought.
It really is. He gives the example of Italian bombings in the 1970s. Is any given bombing the work of leftist extremists or extreme right provocation, or a centrist mise-en-scene to discredit all extreme terrorists? Or again, is it a police-inspired scenario?
All the possibilities.
His answer: all of this is simultaneously true, and the search for proof, indeed the objectivity of the facts, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpretation.
Facts don't help.
He argues that simulation is characterized by a precession of the model. The facts no longer have a specific trajectory. They are born at the intersection of models. This allows for all contradictory interpretations to be true because they are all generated from the same underlying indifferent model.
The model generates all the truths.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard also thoroughly examines the strategy of power in this hyperreal landscape. Power's main weapon, he claims, is no longer brute force or direct censorship.
What is it then?
But rather to re-inject the real and the referential everywhere. It's about constantly persuading us of the reality of the social, of the gravity of the economy, and the finalities of production.
Pumping up the real.
This includes embracing crisis. Think how much political discourse revolves around constant crises, and even desire, with slogans like, "Take your desires for reality."
Right, like advertising slogans.
Baudrillard provocatively argues that it was capital that first fed on the destructuration of every referential, meaning it dismantled objective values like use value. Now, that very same logic of simulation and self-reference is set against capital itself, leaving it without external justification.
So Baudrillard asserts there's a characteristic hysteria of our times, that of the production and reproduction of the real.
A hysteria for the real.
He suggests that what every society looks for in continuing to produce and to overproduce is to restore the real that escapes it. It's an almost desperate attempt to make the real appear by sheer volume.
Piling up stuff to feel real.
That is why today this material production is that of the hyperreal itself. It's not about producing concrete value or traditional commodities anymore, but about generating endless signs of reality to fill a void.
He applies this logic to power itself, stating that power itself has for a long time produced nothing but the signs of its resemblance.
Power just performs being powerful.
It doesn't actually wield substantive control in the old sense, but rather performs its existence. There's a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union that is reconstructed around its disappearance.
We demand the signs because power is gone.
We see the melancholy of societies without power, a deep unease when power seems absent or ineffective. He draws a stark contrast between the Kennedy assassinations and later, less politically charged, simulated attempts on presidents.
Kennedy versus later presidents.
Kennedy, he suggests, died because they still had a political dimension, a mythic weight. Later presidents, by contrast, are mannequins of power, whose assassination attempts might even be staged or perpetrated by simulation, designed to reinforce the idea that power exists and is threatened even when it's not.
Staged assassination attempts, that's extreme.
It's a provocative idea for sure.
What's truly unsettling here is his observation that death is never an absolute criterion, but in this case it is significant. The era of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and the Kennedys, of those who really died simply because they had a mythic dimension that implies death. This era is long gone.
The era of mythic death is over.
It is now the era of murder by simulation, of the generalized aesthetic of simulation, of the murder alibi. In other words, when figures become pure signs, even their death becomes a simulated event, part of the system's spectacle, devoid of genuine tragic meaning.
Death is just another special effect.
This implies that political opposition, the left, critical discourse, are a simulacral contrast through which power attempts to break the vicious circle of its non-existence.
So even opposition helps power seem real.
Power, he states, floats like money, like language, like theory. It effectively uses criticism and negativity not as challenges, but as tools to secrete a phantom of the reality of power, artificially reviving them when they become weak. It's a ruse by the system to avoid its own death or expose its fundamental emptiness.
Power uses critique to stay alive. It's brilliant in a dark way. 3, the media landscape. Implosion and advertising's ubiquity.
Let's dive deeper into the media landscape, which Baudrillard argues is a key site for the operation of simulation. He introduces the fascinating and somewhat controversial TV verite experiment with the Loud family in 1971.
An American Family. Classic.
This was a documentary project where a camera crew filmed a typical American family for 7 months, resulting in 300 hours of unedited broadcasting. The central question that arose was, did the presence of the TV crew and the act of being filmed actually cause the family's subsequent breakup?
The ultimate reality TV question, right?
Baudrillard suggests the family was already hyperreal by the very nature of its selection. A typical ideal American family. This pursuit of statistical perfection already prefigured its collapse into a spectacle.
They were chosen because they were a simulation of the ideal.
He argues that the camera lens comes to pierce lived reality in order to put it to death. He provocatively states, "It is TV that is the truth of the Louds, it is TV that is true, it is TV that renders true."
TV makes the truth.
The medium, in his view, doesn't simply reflect reality or document it, it actively produces and defines it, making the televised version more real than the lived experience itself.
Which is pretty much the basis for all reality TV since, isn't it?
This prompts a fundamental shift in our understanding of truth. This truth, Baudrillard explains, is no longer the reflexive truth of the mirror, which gives a distant objective reflection,
Like looking in a mirror.
nor the perspectival truth of the panoptic system, like a prison guard watching from a tower. Instead, it's the manipulative truth of the test, of the laser that touches and pierces.
Invasive truth.
It's an active, invasive truth that creates what it observes, rather than merely documenting it.
Exactly. He elaborates on the end of the panoptic system. The old ideal of control was transparency through constant centralized surveillance. But the shift is profound. You no longer watch TV, it is TV that watches you live.
TV watches us. How?
He quotes a chilling idea. You are the model. You are the majority. This, he says, is the watershed of a hyperreal sociality, where the real is confused with the model or the medium.
We become the content.
There's no more subject, no more focal point, no more center or periphery, pure flexion or circular inflection. In this hyperreal landscape, there's no more violence or surveillance in the traditional sense. Instead, there's only information, a secret virulence, chain reaction, slow implosion.
Control through information flow.
The system operates not through visible force, but through pervasive internal data loops.
So Baudrillard is suggesting we're not even in Guy Debord's society of the spectacle anymore, where images hide an underlying reality.
We're past that.
McCullison's famous phrase, "the medium is the message," was certainly the first great formula of this new era, signaling that content gets absorbed by the form. But Baudrillard takes it even further.
What's next?
The medium, he argues, is now intangible, diffused, and diffracted in the real, making it impossible to identify or isolate as such. It's a spectralized presence, like an advertising laser sculpture in empty space, where the sign is everywhere, but its source is nowhere.
The medium dissolves into reality itself. Wow.
He uses the analogy of DNA to underscore this. TV, he suggests, is a kind of genetic code that directs the mutation of the real into the hyperreal, similar to how a micromolecular code controls the passage from a representative sphere of meaning to the genetic one of the program signal.
TV as our cultural DNA.
He argues that the traditional world of causality, where we understand clear cause and effect, active versus passive, subject versus object, simply implodes.
Cause and effect breakdown.
The very gap that maintained meaning in these distinctions vanishes in genetic coding and, by extension, in our media-saturated reality. This, he says, is where simulation begins.
The start of simulation.
When the fundamental distinction between poles can no longer be maintained, one enters into simulation and thus into absolute manipulation, not into passivity, but into the indifferentiation of the active and the passive. Everything becomes part of an undifferentiated operational flow.
No more opposites, just flow.
Baudrillard puts forth a very bold and counterintuitive idea. We live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning.
The information paradox. We feel it, don't we?
What's his take on this profound paradox given our constant digital connectivity and the explosion of data?
He offers three fascinating hypotheses. The first, and most conventional, is that information produces meaning, acting as a negentropic factor,
Adding order.
but simply can't keep up with its accelerating loss, leading to a need for antimedia to stem the tide. The second hypothesis is that information is directly destructive of meaning, actively neutralizing it.
Information kills meaning.
But the third, and for Baudrillard, the most compelling hypothesis, is where the opposite occurs. Information devours its own content. It devours communication and the social.
Information eats itself. That's unsettling.
This radical idea directly challenges the common belief that more information necessarily leads to more understanding or connection.
So how exactly does information achieve this bizarre feat of devouring its own content and meaning?
He argues, rather than creating communication, it exhausts itself in the act of staging communication.
Staging communication, like a performance.
Instead of genuinely producing meaning, it exhausts itself in the staging of meaning. Think about the ubiquitous call-in shows where the audience is invited to speak, or the rhetoric of "you are the event" in participatory media.
Yeah, your voice matters.
These are, for Baudrillard, parts of a gigantic process of simulation, a circular arrangement through which one stages the desire of the audience without actually facilitating meaningful exchange or agency. It's a performance of communication, not communication itself.
He explains that the social functions in a closed circuit as a lure. The belief in information, the constant production and consumption of data, becomes tautological proof that the system gives of itself.
The system proves itself by generating noise.
But the masses, he suggests, respond to this with a deep ambivalence, a disaffection, or an enigmatic belief. They know very well, but still engage.
We know it's fake, but we play along.
The second reason for this implosion of meaning is that the mass media, the pressure of information, pursues an irresistible destructuration of the social. The media, then, are producers not of socialization, but of the implosion of the social in the masses.
Media breaks down society. Into what?
Into the masses, an undifferentiated blob. This is a macroscopic extension of meaning's implosion, now affecting society as a whole, transforming it into an indifferent mass.
From society to mass. Okay.
This raises a very interesting point. If McLuhan was right that the medium is the message, meaning the content gets absorbed into the form, what if Baudrillard is saying there's now also the implosion of the medium itself in the real?
The medium implodes too.
That the distinction between the medium and reality has completely collapsed.
That's the critical insight. It leads to what he calls a hyperreal nebula, where the medium's action can't be determined because it's no longer a distinct entity.
A nebula, fuzzy, indistinct.
There are no more media in the literal sense of a mediating power between one reality and another. This is a total circularity of the model, a self-referential loop where content, form, sender, and receiver all collapse into an indistinguishable whole. It's a world without clear boundaries or distinctions.
So if traditional meaning is constantly imploding, and the system actually maximizes speech and the production of superficial meaning, what kind of strategic resistance is even possible against this overwhelming force?
Baudrillard argues against the traditional liberating claim of subjecthood, the idea that individual agency or critical self-expression can challenge the system.
So protesting doesn't work.
Because he says the system now actively encourages and absorbs that very claim. Instead, he proposes that the strategic resistance is that of the refusal of meaning and of the spoken word, or of the hyperconformist simulation of the very mechanisms of the system.
Refusal of meaning, or hyperconformity.
It's not about opposing the system head-on, but about returning to the system its own logic by doubling it, to reflecting meaning, like a mirror, without absorbing it. It's a strategy of pure, object-like indifference, a refusal to play the game of meaning production or consumption, thereby denying the system its fuel.
Become a mirror, reflect it back. Interesting. Let's unpack this idea that all virtual modes of expression are being transformed into that of advertising.
Everything becomes an ad.
This is a powerful, perhaps unsettling claim for Baudrillard.
He describes advertising as having no depth, being instantaneous and instantaneously forgotten. He calls it the triumph of superficial form, of the smallest common denominator of all signification, degree zero of meaning.
Degree zero, the lowest level.
It's the lowest form of energy of the sign, always circulating, never settling into deeper significance. He traces the historical convergence of propaganda and advertising, particularly after the October Revolution and the 1929 market crash.
Propaganda and ads merging.
Propaganda, which was about political ideals, became marketing and merchandising of idea forces, adapting the techniques of commercial advertising. This, he says, signifies a society where there is no longer any difference between the economic and the political, because the same language reigns in both. Everything becomes a matter of pure circulation and image.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard argues that the social itself turns itself into advertising, turns itself over to the popular vote by trying to impose its trademark image.
Society as a brand.
Every ad, every public initiative, every political campaign, he suggests, tries to produce a surplus value of the social to create the impression of a vibrant, desirable collective.
Selling us the social.
This culminates in what he calls absolute advertising, where a sociality everywhere present, an absolute sociality finally realized in absolute advertising, that is to say, also totally dissolved. It's a script whose bewildered audience we are, playing a part in a vast self-referential performance.
Baudrillard then asks a compelling question. What's replacing advertising's traditional thrill today, now that it's become so pervasive and diluted?
Good question. What is it?
He points directly to the languages of computer science. Microprocessing, digitality, cybernetic languages go much further in the direction of the absolute simplification of processes than advertising.
Code is the new advertising.
This is where the new fascination lies, in the pure operationality of code, the seamlessness of algorithms. He even references Philip K. Dick's prophetic vision of the papula, a transistorized advertising implant.
Whoa, an ad implant.
Foreshadowing psychotropic and data processing networks of the automatic piloting of individuals. It's a terrifying vision of advertising becoming embedded not just in our environment, but in our very bodies and minds.
He describes advertising's unique form as dilution. It's no longer a means of communication or of information in a traditional sense. It's its own commodity, voting for itself, completely in unison with the social.
The ad votes for the ad.
Which has, according to Baudrillard, lost its power of illusion and become merely a demand like any other commodity. Even work in this hyperreal state is no longer about production or purpose, but simply employment, a job, a role to play.
Work is just employment. Yeah.
He asserts that true advertising lies therein, in the design of the social, in the exaltation of the social in all its forms. It's a constant self-promotion of the system.
He uses Las Vegas as a perfect early example of the absolute advertising city of the 1950s.
Vegas. Makes sense.
Advertising, he notes, effaces the walls, effaces the streets, the facades, and all the architecture. It faces any support and any depth. It's not about signs on buildings, but the entire city as a sign, a pure surface of stimulation.
The city is the ad.
This leads to a stupefied, hyperreal euphoria. The signs are no longer about selling something real, but about their own circulation and self-referential triumph, creating a dizzying, weightless environment where reality has dissolved into pure spectacle. 4. The drive for replication, clones, holograms, and control.
Here's where Baudrillard dives into something that feels especially prescient today, delving into the very nature of the body and its replication. Cloning.
Cloning. Very sci-fi, but maybe not anymore.
He references a fascinating and truly chilling report from the U.S. of a child supposedly born like a geranium from cuttings. It highlights how deeply this concept of replication was already entering our cultural consciousness.
Born from cuttings.
Yeah.
Wow. He interprets this phenomenon as embodying the dream of an eternal twining substituted for sexual procreation that is linked to death.
Avoiding sex and death through clones.
In other words, cloning offers a way to bypass the messy, uncertain, and ultimately mortal process of natural reproduction. It's a monocellular utopia where the father and the mother have disappeared in the service of a matrix called code.
No parents, just code.
Cloning, for Baudrillard, radically abolishes the mother, but also the father, the intertwining of their genes, the imbrication of their differences, but above all, the joint act that is procreation.
It bypasses the whole biological process.
The clone doesn't beget itself. It sprouts from each of its segments, endlessly reproducible without the need for sexual union or biological heritage.
This raises a profoundly unsettling question for us. What happens to the very notion of the subject, to individuality and uniqueness, when existence is reduced to I plus I plus I plus I, an infinite string of identical copies.
Yeah, where's the me in that?
It sounds like the ultimate erasure of what makes each person distinct.
He argues that the mirror stage is abolished in cloning. No more medium, no more image.
The mirror stage, from psychology.
Right, in Lacanian psychology, it's where a child first recognizes itself as a distinct self through its reflection. In cloning, this process is gone. There was no other to reflect off.
No reflection, no self.
Unlike industrially produced objects, clones are not sexually engendered and know nothing of death. They are the materialization of the double by genetic means. That is to say, the abolition of all alterity and of any imaginary.
No difference, no imagination.
It's an economy of sexuality where uniqueness, difference, and the erotic are eradicated. Furthermore, he suggests that if all information about a being can be found in each of its parts, a single cell, for instance, then the whole loses its meaning.
The whole is just the sum of identical parts.
It's the end of the body, of this singularity called body, which sexuation and procreation typically ensure. The genetic formula, the pure code, becomes the prosthesis par excellence, an abstract matrix from which identical beings emerge through pure and simple renewal, untroubled by difference or death.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard describes this drive for replication as a procession of reproduction over production, a procession of the genetic model over all possible bodies.
Reproduction beats production.
This represents a profound technological reversal, moving from external prosthetics, like a tool that extends our hand, to internalize what he called esotechnical ones, like genetic software that redesigns the body from within.
Technology moving inside us.
The focus shifts from making things to making copies of ourselves.
He then draws a truly striking and uncomfortable parallel between cloning and cancer.
Cloning and cancer?
Oh boy. Stating that the individual is no longer anything but a cancerous metastasis of its base formula. Cancer, he explains, is an unchecked proliferation of a single matrix, an uncontrolled identical reproduction.
Oh, I see the connection. Uncontrolled sameness.
In the process of cloning, Baudrillard argues, nothing opposes itself any longer to the renewal of the same. It's a vision of life becoming a homogeneous, self-replicating, yet ultimately meaningless expansion.
A crucial ambiguity then arises from this unsettling vision. Baudrillard points out that it is at once the triumph of a controlling hypothesis, that of the code and of genetic information, and an eccentric distortion that destroys its coherence.
So perfect control leads to chaos.
This implies that even in its ultimate attempt at control and perfect replication, the system might paradoxically produce unpredictable outcomes, a kind of inherent instability within absolute sameness.
The system eats itself again, maybe?
Let's turn now to holograms as another fascinating facet of this drive for replication and hyperreal perfection.
Holograms. Very Star Trek.
Baudrillard posits that it is the fantasy of seizing reality live that continues ever since Narcissus bent over his spring. The desire to perfectly capture and possess reality, to hold its exact double, is a timeless human obsession.
We want that perfect copy. He explains the allure of the holographic double. The day when your holographic double will be there in space, eventually moving and talking, you will have realized this miracle.
Seeing your perfect double.
Imagine seeing a perfectly three-dimensional moving image of yourself, entirely indistinguishable from the real. But he cautions, then its charm will be lost.
Why? Because it's too perfect.
This perfect replication paradoxically drains the original of its uniqueness. He describes how the TV studio, with its instantaneity and immediacy, transforms people into holographic characters. Immaterial, translucid, through whom the masses pass.
TV makes us holographic.
And this, he claims, has rendered your hand unreal as well.
The closer you get to the simulacrum's perfection, the less real the original feels.
So this isn't just about three-dimensional images. Baudrillard is saying that the closer one gets to the perfection of the simulacrum, the more evident it becomes. How everything escapes representation, escapes its own double and its resemblance.
The perfect copy shows the original isn't perfect.
The very act of perfect representation exposes the elusive, ungraspable nature of the real itself.
He takes this to a deeply philosophical level, arguing there is no real. The third dimension is only the imaginary of a two-dimensional world, the fourth that of a three-dimensional universe.
Each dimension just imagines the next.
This is an escalation in the production of a real that is more and more real, a kind of infinite regress where each layer of reality is just a more perfect simulation of the one before it. He notes, What's exact is already too exact.
Too exact.
Nothing resembles itself. Holographic reproduction is already no longer real, is already hyper-real. It has simulation value, not reproductive truth value. Simulation value, not truth value.
Okay.
This relentless pursuit of perfect replication, paradoxically, leads not to more truth or greater understanding, but to what he calls a murderous power of the potentialization of the truth, where the ideal copy destroys the original.
The perfect copy kills the original.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard makes a truly audacious claim. Even the exact sciences come dangerously close to pataphysics.
Pataphysics, the science of imaginary solutions.
Right. Baudrillard suggests that exact sciences approach this because they rely on an objectivist whim of the deconstruction and exact reconstruction of the world, founded on a tenacious and naive faith in a pact of the similitude of things to themselves.
They assume reality is perfectly knowable.
They assume the real object is perfectly equal to itself, identical to its analytical components, which for Baudrillard is precisely why they miss its shadow, its secret, its ungraspable essence. Their very method and its quest for perfect knowledge helps to dissolve the real. Now, let's zoom out to the biggest, most chilling scale imaginable. What Baudrillard calls the apotheosis of simulation through the nuclear threat.
Ah, the bomb. The ultimate simulation.
This is a truly profound and unsettling thought.
He argues that the balance of terror is never anything but the spectacular slope of a system of deterrence that has insinuated itself from the inside into all the cracks of daily life.
Deterrence is everywhere, not just nuclear.
The nuclear threat, he says, only serves to seal the trivialized system of deterrence that's already pervasive in media, in our economic choices, in our daily lives. His crucial point is this. It is not the direct threat of atomic destruction that paralyzes our lives. It is deterrence that gives them leukemia.
Leukemia, a slow sickness.
The slow, insidious sickness comes from the fact that even the real atomic clash is precluded. The war, the destruction never happens, and precisely because it never happens, the system of deterrence becomes absolutely dominant, controlling everything without ever having to unleash its full power.
The threat is enough. The war never needs to happen.
This raises an important question. If Baudrillard suggests that deterrence precludes war, how does he argue this? How does the very existence of such an overwhelming threat actually prevent conflict rather than provoke it?
Yeah, seems counterintuitive.
Deterrence, he explains, is the neutral, implosive violence of metastable systems. There's no longer a subject of deterrence, nor an adversary, nor a strategy. It is a planetary structure of the annihilation of stakes.
Annihilation of stakes, meaning nothing matters enough to fight over.
The risk of nuclear annihilation, Baudrillard claims, only serves as a pretext, through the sheer sophistication of weapons, for installing a universal security system, a universal lockup and control system.
The bomb justifies total control.
Its true effect is not an atomic clash, but rather the much greater probability of any real event, of anything that would be an event in the general system and upset its balance. Therefore, he concludes, the balance of terror is the terror of balance.
Terror of balance, afraid of upsetting the system.
It's a system designed to paralyze all potential for true change or conflict, freezing the world in a state of static control.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard draws a striking analogy. Nuclear deterrence is like international capital in the orbital zone of monetary speculation.
Money floating in cyberspace.
Just as financial capital can control vast sums without physical exchange, the money of destruction, the sheer destructive potential, suffices to control all the violence and potential conflicts around the world without ever needing to be actually deployed. The threat alone is enough.
He extends this idea even to seemingly benign technologies like peaceful nuclear power stations.
Even power plants.
He states everywhere where irreversible apparatuses of control are elaborated, everywhere where the notion of security becomes omnipotent, it is the system of deterrence that grows. And around it grows the historical, social, and political desert.
A desert grows around control systems.
This is a gigantic involution that makes every conflict, every finality, every confrontation contract in proportion to this blackmail that interrupts, neutralizes, freezes them all. No genuine revolt or narrative can unfold because the ultimate threat of annihilation is always there, an invisible cage.
He even brings in the space race, arguing it played exactly the same role as nuclear escalation. It created a model of universal gravitation, of satellisation.
Space race as deterrence.
The intense public fascination with space launches wasn't primarily about scientific discovery, but for Baudrillard, about the perfection of the programming and the technical manipulation, the sheer operationality of the system.
We were fascinated by the control, not the exploration.
Their truth is to be the models of simulation, the model vectors of a system of planetary control. The fascinating paradox, he notes, is that he who is satellized is not who one might think.
Who is satellized then?
Through the orbital inscription of a spatial object, it is the planet Earth that becomes a satellite. We on Earth become the observed, the controlled.
Earth is the satellite. Mind blown.
He points to the simultaneity of the U.S.-Soviet space link-up and China abandoning ideograms for the Roman alphabet in 1975, illustrating not just peaceful coexistence, but a deeper satellization of language, a universalization of a single code, implying a global system of control.
Universal code, planetary control. It all fits.
So what does this all mean for us living on this satellized planet? Baudrillard suggests that events at ground level no longer have any meaning. They are no longer anything but the duplex effect of simulation at the summit.
Ground-level events are just echoes.
He uses the Vietnam War as an example, a horrific, brutal conflict, which Baudrillard chillingly argues was, at bottom, nothing but a crucial episode of peaceful coexistence.
Vietnam as peaceful coexistence. How?
It paved the way for China's entry into the global modus vivendi. The war, despite its immense human cost, was, in his view, nothing but a simulacrum to enable the Vietnamese to seem to countenance a compromise and for Nixon to make the Americans swallow the withdrawal of their troops.
The war was a show.
The ideological seriousness of war is gone. It's a process that triumphs well beyond these appearances, a game played out for the sake of the system's stability.
It's just keeping the balance, the terror of balance. V. The nature of history and reality and simulation.
Let's unpack Baudrillard's assertion that history is a strong myth, perhaps, along with the unconscious, the last great myth.
History as a myth. Okay.
What does he mean by this, suggesting that history itself is less about factual truth and more about a constructed narrative, a powerful story we tell ourselves?
He discusses retro films like Peter Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show or Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon.
Ah, those meticulously recreated period pieces.
He describes them not just as historical dramas, but as perfect remakes. Large photo-kino historico-synthesis machines. They are so meticulously authentic, so perfectly reproduced, that they paradoxically lacks the imaginary and the hallucination inherent to cinema itself.
Too perfect again. Kills the magic.
He differentiates Kubrick's cool, almost detached operational scenario of history from Visconti's sensual, richly historical films. This, for Baudrillard, signifies cinema attempting to abolish itself in the cinematographic or televised hyperreal.
Cinema trying to become hyperreal.
The perfection of these retro films, he argues, is disquieting, precisely because they're too good, too purged, pure. The hyper-realist restitution, they're more real than real, and in doing so, they erase the messy, lived reality of the past.
This raises an important, almost paradoxical question. Baudrillard claims that cinema itself contributed to the disappearance of history and to the advent of the archive.
Cinema killed history. How?
How could a medium so dedicated to capturing reality and preserving moments actually contribute to the disappearance of history?
He explains that photography and cinema secularized history, effectively stripping it of its mythical living qualities, by fixing history in visible objective form through images that can be endlessly reproduced and archived.
Turning it into data.
They did so at the expense of the myths that once traversed it. History, in this photographic and cinematic form, loses its fabulous character, the mythical energy of an event or of a narrative, when it's captured, categorized, and endlessly replayed.
It becomes dead information.
It becomes a purely operational scenario, a static record, rather than a dynamic, unfolding story with a living impact.
Now let's turn to a particularly powerful and controversial example Baudrillard addresses. Holocaust, the televised miniseries that aired in 1978.
Right, the TV event.
Baudrillard makes an incredibly stark statement. Forgetting extermination is part of extermination because it is also the extermination of memory, of history, of the social.
Forgetting is part of the crime itself.
He's not just talking about historical amnesia, but something far more insidious.
This forgetting, he argues, is so profound that it must be effaced by an artificial memory. This artificial memory is precisely the restaging of extermination, but late, much too late. through a medium that is itself cold, radiating forgetfulness, deterrence, and extermination.
TV creates artificial memory that helps us forget.
He chillingly claims, one no longer makes the Jews pass through the crematorium or the gas chamber, but through the soundtrack and image track, through the universal screen and the microprocessor.
Oh, God, that's brutal.
Forgetting in this way doesn't just happen, it finally achieves its aesthetic dimension in retro. The tragedy is reenacted, but as a simulated, mediated event that paradoxically reinforces forgetting.
So Baudrillard is suggesting that televised remembrance, like the Holocaust series, isn't actually lifting the weight of Auschwitz or truly commemorating it, but rather perpetuating it in another guise, a medium of deterrence.
That's his argument, yeah. It seems almost impossible to accept that a work intended to educate and remember could have such a negative effect.
It really does.
Precisely. He asserts that Holocaust was primarily and exclusively an event, or rather, a televised object. It attempted to rekindle a cold historical event through a cold medium, television, and for the masses who are themselves cold.
Cold event, cold medium, cold masses.
The meticulous pedagogical orchestration around the broadcast, the accompanying discussions, the educational guides, was, in his view, a panicked blackmailing to create artificial heat for a dead body of the social, with polls merely verifying the televisual success of the medium itself, rather than any genuine historical engagement.
It was just about TV succeeding.
It was a simulation of remembrance, designed to make us feel we had remembered, thus allowing us to forget more profoundly.
This raises an important question. Why does Baudrillard claim TV is harmless to the imagination?
Harmless seems powerful.
Because he says it no longer carries any imaginary, and this for the simple reason that it is no longer an image. He contrasts this sharply with cinema, which, even in its most realistic forms, still retains the double of the phantasm, of the mirror, of the dream elements that engage our deeper imagination.
TV isn't even image anymore. What is it?
Just information, flow.
Yeah.
Baudrillard argues that TV and the nuclear are fundamentally of the same nature. They have the same power of deterrence as cold systems do.
TV and the bomb are the same.
TV, he says, cools and neutralizes the meaning and the energy of events, turning them into bland information. The true contamination, he warns, is never biological and radioactive, but rather a mental destructuration through a mental strategy of catastrophe.
Mental contamination, not radiation.
He takes the example of The China Syndrome, a film about a nuclear meltdown. For him, the spectacle of nuclear catastrophe in film or media is not about a real event. It's about accustoming the people to the ideology and the discipline of absolute security.
Disaster movies train us for control.
A genuine catastrophe, he chillingly suggests, would be a retrograde incident, an actual event that disrupts the perfect simulated order.
The real disaster is reality itself breaking through.
Let's now introduce J.G. Ballard's novel Crash as a fictional work that, for Baudrillard, perfectly captures this hyper-real world.
Ballard's Crash. Intense.
It's a novel that explores the unsettling fusion of technology, sex, death, and the accident.
He describes the novel's disturbing fusion where all the erotic terms are technical. The adequation of chrome and mucus as a one form to another.
Sex and machines merging.
Pleasure, in Crash, is pure and simple discharge, confused on the same wavelength with the violence of the technical apparatus. The accident, which is usually seen as an aberration, is no longer marginal. It's at the heart.
The accident becomes the norm.
It has become the rule. It has devoured the rule. It is the accident that gives form to life. It is the accident, the insane, that is the sex of life. The automobile, therefore, becomes the immense metaphor of life itself, a space of technological eroticism and controlled catastrophe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the photograph and cinema play a crucial role in Crash as well. The shining and saturated surface of traffic and of the accident is without depth, but it is always doubled in Vaughn's camera lens, the central character obsessed with car crashes.
The camera is part of it.
The photographic film, he states, is part of the universal, hyper-real, metallized, and corporeal layer of traffic and flows. The photo is no more a medium than technology or the body. It's an indistinguishable part of the hyper-real environment.
Photo, tech, body, all the same layer.
There's no more temporal depth either. Just like the past, the future ceases to exist in turn. The camera's eye, capturing everything in perfect two-dimensional clarity, replaces time and other depths.
Opening everything.
Signifying for Baudrillard that this universe is without secrets. Everything is on the surface, everything is visible, therefore nothing is truly hidden.
So what does this all mean for the world depicted in Crash and, by extension, our own?
In Crash, everything is hyperfunctional. Since traffic and accident, technology and death, sex and simulation are like a single, large, synchronous machine.
A perfectly functioning death machine.
It's a wrap. The novel presents an indefinable, therefore fascinating object, neither good nor bad, ambivalent. It's a world where distinctions collapse, but this collapse itself is alluring.
Crash, he argues, is the current model of this science fiction that is no longer one.
Not sci-fi anymore.
He's saying it transcends traditional science fiction. There is neither fiction nor reality anymore. Hyperreality abolishes both. It's hypercriticism, a form of critique that reaches a resolution of all finality or critical negativity.
Beyond critique.
It's simply fascinating, though this fascination does not imply a value judgment. It's a work that embodies the very state of simulation it describes.
Let's unpack Baudrillard's general categories of simulacra as this helps to map his ideas. He identifies the first order as natural, based on imitation, like the idea of a God's image reflecting humanity.
First order, imitation. Got it.
The second order is productive, based on energy and the machine, with a Promethean aim of expansion and industrial reproduction.
Second order, production, industry. Classical science fiction, he explains, belongs firmly to this second order. It was an unbounded projection of the real world of production, mechanical or energetic extensions.
Like rockets and robots.
Think of rockets, robots, vast industrial empires in space. It was essentially an extrapolation of our own world of production, not qualitatively different from it, just bigger and faster.
This prompts a critical question. What happens then in Baudrillard's implosive era of models, this third order of simulacra? How does science fiction change when reality itself is already a simulation?
He states, the models no longer constitute either transcendence or projection. They are themselves an anticipation of the real, and thus leave no room for any sort of fictional anticipation.
The model is the future. No need for fiction.
This is the realm of simulation in the cybernetic sense, where nothing distinguishes this operation from the operation itself and the gestation of the real. There is no more fiction.
Fiction disappears.
Classical sci-fi imagined an expanding universe. But now, due to planetary saturation or saturation of meaning, a reversal is produced. Something else takes place, in the imaginary as well. We no longer need to imagine the future. It's already here, generated by the models.
So, when the map covers the whole territory, Baudrillard argues, something like the principle of reality disappears.
The real vanishes when simulation is total.
The very conquest of space, for example, is equal to derealizing, dematerializing human space, or to transferring it into a hyperreal of simulation. It's not about expanding our grasp of reality, but transforming it.
This leads to a profound reversal. The goal becomes to put decentered situations, models of simulation in place, and to contrive to give them the feeling of the real.
Making the simulation feel real.
We strive to reinvent the real as fiction precisely because it has disappeared from our life.
Reinventing the real because it's gone.
He uses the astounding example of East German factories, simulacra, that were built to not produce anything, their activity consumed in a game of orders to the Soviet Union.
Fake factories making nothing.
What is fascinating here is not the opposition between real factories and fake factories, but on the contrary, the lack of distinction between the two. The hyperreal indifference, where the fake and real are indistinguishable, is the true science-fictional quality of our age.
The indistinguishability is the sci-fi. 6, the human and the bestial. Dehumanization and lost connections. Let's unpack Baudrillard's analysis of our relationship with animals, which he sees as deeply intertwined with our understanding of ourselves.
Animals. Yeah, that's an interesting turn.
He argues that in laboratories, we treat animals with experimental ferocity in the name of science. Not just to understand them, but to extort from them a confession of objectivity, to reduce them to mere biological data, stripping them of their subjective reality.
Forcing them to be objective data points.
He explains that concepts like bestiality or savagery, with their connotations of unintelligibility and radical strangeness to human reason, do not exist in the modern scientific paradigm. Instead, the most bestial behaviors are resolved in science by being pathologized or categorized.
Science explains away the wildness.
We are, in a sense, trying to kill the principle of uncertainty in animals by forcing them into our rational frameworks. He argues that animals have preceded us on the path of liberal extermination.
They went first. How?
Their modern treatment, particularly in industrial settings, retraces the vicissitudes of the manipulation of humans. The way we treat animals is a chilling foreshadowing of how we treat ourselves.
He shares some truly disturbing examples of industrially bred animals. Rabbits suffering from morbid anxiety, coprophagy,
Eating feces.
and sterility. Chickens succumbing to hysteria leading to collapse, cannibalism in pigs, and calves compulsively licking themselves to death. These are profound signs of distress.
Animals going mad from the system.
And Baudrillard points out strikingly that animals somatize cancers, gastric ulcers, myocardial infarction in mice, pigs, chickens.
They get human diseases.
Their bodies are literally manifesting the stress of their unnatural existence. This, he notes, forces the need for zoo psychiatry, a branch of psychology for animals. The only remedy, paradoxically, is often the simplest. Space. A bit more space, and a lot of the problems observed would disappear.
Just give them space.
Yet even this proposed solution, he observes, is still about the alliance of the morality and the meaning of a well-understood interest, profitability. We give them enough space only to make them profitable.
What's genuinely fascinating and deeply unsettling here is how Baudrillard connects this treatment of animals directly to our own human experience. One has never said better how much humanism, normality, quality of life were nothing but the vicissitudes of profitability.
Our quality of life is just about profit, too.
He draws a direct parallel between the animal sick from surplus value, suffering from the demands of overproduction, and humans sick from industrial concentration, from the demands of the modern workplace. We're all part of the same system of commodification.
He emphasizes that the psychic life of the animal is discovered only when they are maladapted to the death one is preparing for him.
We only care about their minds when they break down.
This chillingly parallels how psychology was rediscovered for prisoners or how quality of work programs emerged for factory workers. Everyone needs a psychic life to adapt, to be productive within the system.
Psychology as an adaptation tool.
Animals become beasts of burden, beasts of demand, beasts of consumption, beasts of somatization. He concludes with profound resonance that our destiny has never been separated from theirs. Their fate reflects our own.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard suggests that animals were demoted to the status of inhumanity as reason and humanism progressed, a logic that directly parallels racism.
Downgrading animals as reason progressed.
As human reason claimed supremacy, animals were stripped of their sacred symbolic meaning and relegated to a lesser exploitable status.
He starkly contrasts the sacred, often divine character of animals in primitive societies, where, for example, the burros are macaws, indicating a profound, undifferentiated unity with their modern status.
Where they were equals, almost.
He explains how modern sentimentality toward animals is a sure sign of the disdain in which we hold them.
Our love for pets is disdain.
We no longer sacrifice or punish them, engaging with them in a relationship of symbolic exchange. Instead, we have made of them a racially inferior world, no longer even worthy of our justice, but only of our affection and social charity. They become objects of pity, not partners in a shared existence.
He also discusses the changing meaning of monstrosity, moving from rich, metamorphic, mythological beasts like centaurs or sphinxes, who held deep, often sacred, symbolic power,
Mythical monsters.
to spectacular monstrosity like King Kong, who comes to liberate us from our culture. King Kong, for Baudrillard, is a reflection of our own monstrousness, a product of a culture that has lost its connection to authentic wildness.
Baudrillard asserts that all inhumanity has gone over to the side of men. All humanity has gone over to the side of captive bestiality.
We became the monsters.
This is a stark reversal. Animals, he argues, like madmen or children, have followed this uninterrupted process of annexation through extermination, meaning they've been captured, categorized, and made to speak within our systems of knowledge.
Making them speak our language.
We have been making animals speak, as one has made the insane children, sex, Foucault, speak. The challenge of madness, he notes, was historically met by the hypothesis of the unconscious, making their once absurd messages intelligible within our frameworks.
Finding ways to understand them.
Children and primitives are now heard through our codes, their natural states defined by our science.
This leads to a truly profound and lingering question. What about the animals themselves? They do not speak our language. They do not enter our symbolic economy in the same way.
They remain outside our meaning systems.
In a universe of increasing speech where everything is compelled to articulate itself, only they remain mute.
Their silence, Baudrillard argues, weighs more and more heavily on our organization of meaning. while we tirelessly try to make them speak through fables, through scientific models, through our attempts to interpret their behavior, they only furnish the responses one asks for.
They only tell us what we want to hear.
Their silence is not empty. Rather, their silence analyzes us, forcing us to confront the limitations of our own systems of understanding.
Their silence questions us.
Animals, he argues, have no unconscious because they have a territory. Men have only had an unconscious since they lost a territory. Their profound, stubborn resistance to being fully assimilated into our codes forces us to change hypotheses, to question our anthropocentric assumptions about meaning and reality.
We lost our territory, gained an unconscious. Wow. 7. The unsolvable quandary. The remainder and nihilism. Let's unpack a concept Baudrillard introduces called the remainder. He notes something very peculiar about it. There's no clear opposing term for remainder, like there is for left-right or see-mother.
A remainder, what's left over, but slipperier.
It doesn't fit into our usual binary logic.
He explains that the remainder refers to much more than a clear division. A turning and reversible structure, an always imminent structure of reversion, in which one never knows which is the remainder of the other.
Reversible, what's the remainder of what?
It's a dynamic, shifting concept. He applies this directly to the social. Who can say if the remainder of the social is the residue of the non-socialized, or if it is not the social itself that is the remainder, the gigantic waste product?
Is society the waste product of? Not society.
The very system designed to eliminate waste might itself become the ultimate waste.
So if the social, in its relentless progression and drive for perfection, attempts to eliminate all residue, all that is left over unsocialized, it paradoxically becomes residual itself.
It becomes the very thing it tried to get rid of.
The impossibility of determining what is the remainder of the other characterizes the phase of simulation and the death throes of distinctive systems. Everything in this state loses its distinctiveness and becomes a kind of indistinguishable leftover.
What's truly fascinating here is Baudrillard's observation that the remainder makes you laugh.
Laugh. Why?
It elicits a kind of nervous, uneasy laughter because it's obscene, meaning it's reversible and is exchanged for itself. Laughter, he suggests, comes from this lack of distinction in reversible figures like sex or death, where the clear boundaries have dissolved.
Laughing at the absurdity of it all.
Today, he argues, the remainder has become the weighty term. It's on this notion of the leftover, the unsaid, the marginal, that a new intelligibility is founded.
The leftovers become important.
This leads to the privilege of all the remainders in all domains of the not said, the feminine, the crazy, the marginal, of excrement and waste in art. These previously marginalized elements now hold a new, strange power, precisely because they resist categorization and meaning.
Let's turn to Baudrillard's rather scathing critique of the modern university, which he says is in ruins. Non-functional in the social arenas of the market and employment, lacking cultural substance or an end purpose of knowledge.
The university is dead. Ouch.
This is a stark assessment of an institution typically seen as central to society.
He describes a panic on the part of university administrators as value becomes dissociated from its contents. Diplomas, he says, will proliferate and continue to circulate, a bit like floating capital or eurodollars. They will spiral without referential criteria, becoming completely devalorized.
Diplomas become worthless floating signs.
The university, therefore, becomes a site of a desperate initiation to the empty form of value, merely teaching how to operate within a system that has lost its meaning.
Learning the empty game.
Strikes, he argues, paradoxically now, regenerate the ideal of a possible university, playing a role for the left to re-inject an idea of justice into a rotten apparatus that otherwise lacks purpose.
Even strikes just prop up the ideal.
This raises a very pointed question from Baudrillard. He suggests the left, despite its revolutionary aims, desperately reproduces power because it wants power, and therefore the left believes in it and revives it precisely where the system puts an end to it.
The left keeps power alive by fighting it.
It's as if the left, by constantly trying to critique and overthrow power, inadvertently grants it renewed legitimacy in an era where power itself is becoming disembodied.
He argues that the student protests of May 1968, though often reinterpreted as a fight for concrete political gains, were actually a first violent reaction to the saturation of the social, a retraction, a challenge to the hegemony of the social.
May 68 wasn't about demands, but refusal.
Students, in Baudrillard's view, were brandishing its cadaver, the corpse of the university and traditional social structures, in the face of power, signaling that the system itself was exhausted.
So what does this all mean for us, the individuals within this transfinite universe of simulation?
Baudrillard declares that no one is represented nor representative of anything anymore. We are, in his words, simulators, concave mirrors radiated by the social, a radiation without a light source, power without origin, without distance.
We're just mirrors reflecting nothing specific.
We are not distinct subjects, but rather reflections within a self-referential system that has no outside.
He states, we are no longer in a relation toward capital of uncertain or victorious forces, but in a political one. That is the phantasm of revolution.
Trapped in the dream of revolution.
We're trapped in a dream of revolution that can never truly materialize. Instead, we are in a relation of defiance, of seduction, and of death toward this universe that is no longer one.
Defiance, seduction, death.
Capital, he argues, is irresponsible, irreversible, ineluctable. It offers a fantastic spectacle of its decomposition, constantly consuming and reproducing itself. We are simply nomads of this desert, living in a jungle of signs, traversing a landscape where meaning has evaporated.
Finally, let's unpack Baudrillard's unique and often misunderstood take on nihilism, which he sees as profoundly different from his past forms.
Nihilism, the big one.
He outlines earlier forms, romanticism, which sought the destruction of appearances to find a deeper truth.
Destroying surfaces.
And surrealism, or political nihilism, which aimed for the destruction of meaning or social order for a revolutionary end.
Destroying meaning.
But our current nihilism, he says, is the nihilism of transparency, neither aesthetic nor political. There is no longer an apocalypse, no grand dramatic end.
No big bang, just fizzle.
Today it is the procession of the neutral, of forms of the neutral and of indifference. Everything is simply absorbed into an indifferent, seamless flow.
Nihilism as neutrality. Indifference.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Baudrillard says that fascination, in contrast to seduction and a dialectical reason, is a nihilistic passion par excellence. It is the passion proper to the mode of disappearance.
We're fascinated by things vanishing.
We are drawn to things not for their meaning or truth, but for the sheer spectacle of their vanishing.
He elaborates on this. We are fascinated by all forms of disappearance, of our disappearance, melancholic and fascinated, such as our general situation in an era of involuntary transparency.
Melancholic and fascinated. Sounds about right.
He paints a picture of cascading implosions. Implosion of meaning in the media, implosion of the social in the masses. Infinite growth of the masses is a function of the acceleration of the system. Energetic impasse. Point of inertia, a destiny of inertia for a saturated world.
Everything grinding to a halt in saturation.
This all sounds incredibly bleak, and it begs the question, is Baudrillard himself a nihilist?
Yeah.
He states, almost directly, if it is nihilistic to be obsessed by the mode of disappearance and no longer by the mode of production, then I am a nihilist.
Yes.
However, he argues that the system itself is also nihilistic in its power to pour everything, including what denies it, into indifference.
The system is nihilistic too.
It absorbs all opposition, all meaning, into its own indifferent flow. Death no longer has a stage, he says, on which to represent itself. It simply vanishes into the system. There is no more hope for meaning in a traditional sense.
But surprisingly, he offers a glimmer of defiance, a kind of radical hope. He concludes that appearances, they are immortal, invulnerable to the nihilism of meaning or of non-meaning itself.
Appearances survive. The surface.
Even if truth is gone, appearances persist.
This is where seduction begins. It's in the play of appearances, the surface, that new possibilities emerge outside the suffocating grip of meaning or its absence.
Seduction, playing with appearances. Okay, what a journey. From the procession of simulacra to the hyperreal, through the unsettling examples of Disneyland, Watergate, cloning, and the Cold War, we've explored Baudrillard's radical assertion of a fundamental shift.
That's a lot to take in.
It's a move from a world of representation where signs point to a deeper reality to one of pure simulation where signs precede and shape reality, often without any original reference. It's a world where the copy is not merely indistinguishable from the original, but is the original.
What's truly fascinating here is how Baudrillard challenges us to rethink our fundamental understanding of truth, reality, and even ourselves. He's not just predicting the future. He's describing a present where the real has already been superseded by its own signs.
Yeah, feels very now.
His insights push us to consider the profound implications of living in a world where the distinction between real and artificial has dissolved, leading to a new, subtle form of power and control.
So, what does this all mean for you listening? Perhaps it's an invitation to look for the real in unexpected places, or to question the seamless operational realities we encounter every day.
That Instagram feed again.
From the perfectly filtered image on social media to the seemingly objective news report. Baudrillard forces us to confront the possibility that what we perceive as authentic may itself be a carefully constructed simulacrum, designed to maintain a particular order or even just to maintain itself.
This raises an important question for you to ponder. In a world where even catastrophes and crises might be artificial occurrences, designed to maintain a historical investment under hypnosis, to keep us perpetually engaged with a manufactured reality, how do you truly distinguish genuine experience from a perfectly orchestrated scenario?
How indeed. A tough question, Enon. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. Keep questioning the world around you.
Keep questioning. Thanks for listening.